Please stand. My brothers and sisters, we draw our attention to the good news as recorded by Matthew. After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone, and meanwhile the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the winds were against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. They cried out, "It's a ghost!" And they were in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage. It is I, do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to walk to you upon the water." Jesus' response, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter. Jesus said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, truly you are the Son of God." The gospel of Christ. Praise be to you, Christ. Please be seated. So often people, talk to me about their faith, about their experience of faith, or their experience of a lack of faith. And I asked them, well, what has brought about your faith? And they were like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, how do you get to the point where you actually come to believe that this Jesus is Son of God, this Jesus is Messiah? How did you get here? And most of the time, it takes a lot of coercion to get them to understand that perhaps they really have never done the work, the homework, that is really invited by God to us to engage in so that we could come to a clearer understanding. So I say to them, well, why do you believe in Jesus and not Buddha? Why do you believe in Jesus and not Muhammad? And most of the time, what they will say is, well, I was raised this tradition. I was raised believing in Jesus. And I said, so you've never done any of the work to come to faith? And they're like, no, what are you talking about? I've been baptized. I've been confirmed. I'm like, no. But you've never done the actual work of a process, an intellectual pursuit to see whether or not this person, Jesus, is trustworthy. Is he trustworthy? Out of all the choices that we can make of what to believe in, how do you come to the point of knowing that this Jesus can be trusted as true? And they're like, well, what do you mean? Well, you need to look at the documents. You should read and take a look at the Quran. You should look at the writings of Buddha. You should explore all of these things, but also equally, you should read the Gospels and the New Testament. You're talking about the Bible. Yes, it is culminated in what we now call a Bible. And because, the Bible now has this bad name, right? Because everyone's running around quoting out of the Bible, right, to use it as a weapon against one another. I'm like, no, but you also have to understand these are historical documents. These are documents written by, first and foremost, Paul, 30 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and ascension of Jesus. Paul has an encounter with Jesus, which brings him to Christianity, Christianity meaning a relationship with Jesus, and ultimately begins to write to other churches, other groups of believers, just like us here, and you are participating at a distance, and he reflects upon what he has come to know about who Jesus is, and then you have the Gospels. The Gospels of themselves are historical literary documents. They are what they are. They are clearly an indication of groups of people who have been taught by the apostle that they're written under, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, And these communities remember what was taught them, and they're culminating, putting it together into a document. These are historical documents. Oh, so it's all in the Bible. No, if you're really very interested, you can read Josephus, you can read, there's a number of other outside sources that are not part of the Bible that refer to this man, Jesus, and who and what he is and what his believers believed and said. There's not just what's in the Bible for us to go to. There are other historical documents that speak to who this Jesus is. So my point to them then is, you have to look at you have to look at his life, the life of Jesus. You have to look at his teachings. You have to look at his death, and then ultimately you have to look at the fact that hundreds upon hundreds of people indicated, and Paul writes this in his letter, that they saw this dead man, Jesus crucified, risen from the dead. And so they testify that they saw this. This is testimony. People actually said this. It's not as if we sit here 2,000 years later just dumped with this stuff and we're just supposed to believe because someone told us to believe. We are invited to participate in an active conversation, argument, discussion with God about whether or not this Jesus is worthy to be trusted or not. But that's a process we should all be participating in. Never just accepting. How do I just accept what someone or some institution tells me to believe? There has to be a process by which we go through that intellectual pursuit ourselves and come to a point of believing that this Jesus is trustworthy. Now, what does all this have to do with this gospel? Well, Peter at this point, right? Jesus is coming toward Peter on the water. Peter now, at this point of his relationship with Jesus, has already seen his life, how Jesus lives, his compassion, his mercy, has already seen his miracles. Peter has already heard of his teaching. So Peter already has intellectual knowledge and experience by which he says, if it is truly you, if it is you, Jesus, then command me to step out onto the water. But Peter just doesn't pop up and have this belief in Jesus and say, okay, I'll come out. What Peter's basically saying, if it is you, and he's saying if it's you because if it is you, I believe this can be done because I have put my trust from my experience and my knowledge of you, Jesus, that if it is you and you command me to walk, then I can step out and walk on the water. That same experience that Peter has is not locked into a 2,000-year-old story and indication and circumstance of this time. It is something that is proper to us as well. We should be having, and you've heard me preach about this time and time again, we should be having this personal relationship with Jesus that our faith just isn't blind because someone told us or we were raised a certain faith tradition or, this person Jesus is just who we worship on a Sunday. I'm sorry, that's not good enough. It's not good enough because at a time when there are storms, we need to know that the person that we have faith in is trustworthy, is true, is truly God's Son, is truly the divine, is truly the sacred. Because otherwise, what happens when we are surrounded by the darkness, and we were commenting about this coming to church today, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, there's so much going on in the world, and because technology is at a point that we can actually see things happening in real time, right? That we watch this, right? The poor man down in Montgomery, Alabama, right, who was beaten, and it happens in like 40 seconds later, maybe even less, it's on TikTok, right? And there's a video, right? And but you're watching this in real time, and because most of the time we share all the bad stuff that happens more than the good stuff, that becomes our focal point. And that's what we get fed. We get fed that all the time. So when we get fed that all the time and those waves have us terribly concerned, all of a sudden then we have to ask ourselves, who is it that we trust in and why? Why is that? Now listen, the other part about all this is these guys in this boat, half of them are fishermen. Half. They've been raised, since they were that big, to be on ships. On boats. They know how to navigate these waters. This storm is not unusual for them. It is the fourth watch of the night, which means that it is almost right before sunrise, okay? Which means they've been battling this wind a very long time. But did you notice? In Matthew's gospel, it's different than the other gospels. In Matthew's gospel, it's a cry, we're going to sink. We're sinking here. That's not the case here. These are coming across as very skilled fishermen with skills who are not crying out in fear for drowning. They're not. Matthew's gospel doesn't have that. That's not here. The intriguing thing is, even though they're not crying out for help, Jesus is still coming toward them. Even though they believe that by their own skill set, they can make it to the other side. And the fact is, they may have been able to do that. It's taken them a very long time to get to this part, and the sun is just now coming up, so they've been fighting this wind a very long time. I'm sure they're exhausted. But recognize, even before they are crying out for help or that they are in fear of drowning, Jesus is already on his way to them. So if we're looking at the documents as being actual documents portraying the life and teaching and attitude and character of Jesus and as the manifestation of God in human form here on earth, then we already have a situation here where Jesus already knows that he should be out there and he'll be coming to help them. And when he approaches, when he is there, and when he gets Peter finally back into the boat, what happens? The winds die down. Peter is a skilled fisherman. There is no doubt, Has been doing this a very long time, probably had seen storms, no big deal. When they see Jesus coming, his point simply is, if it is you, call me out. And Jesus' response here, there's no prerequisites, It's not as though you need to do this, or the other thing, and then come to me. Matthew has it as simply Jesus says, come. And so Peter, trusting in who he is looking at and focused on, steps out of the boat and starts walking. Notice that when Peter starts feeling the strength of the wind, when he is impacted and starts looking around, it is then when he takes his eyes off of the one who he has come to trust and believe in, when he takes his eyes off of that person, then he starts to sink. And we always think here that Jesus is being harsh, that Jesus is saying, why, you of such little faith, why didn't you? It's in the Greek, it's not like that. In the Greek, it's identified as, why couldn't you just have looked at me and held on to faith just a little bit longer? It's not that Peter lacked the faith. He's the only guy who got out of the boat. Okay, so you got to give him some points for this, for all this stuff and all the times that Peter gets in trouble for opening his mouth and saying a whole bunch of weird stuff, and the poor guy all through history will be quoted, for saying these things. And I'm sure Peter's in heaven going, oh, they're using that gospel again today. Won't they ever let me live this down, right? This is the only guy who gets out of the boat. This is the only one. And starts walking upon the water. He's the only one who has had that experience. But such is it that he trusts that the one who is telling him to come, he has already experienced, seen, witnessed, and learned who this Jesus is, that he knows that this is possible for Jesus to accomplish. He knows that Jesus calling him out on the water is nothing for this man Jesus to do. And I'm not sure we, because we haven't had the same level of interrogation of our faith in this Jesus, and why is it that we believe in him, and what level, how do we perceive him, in our lives? How do we perceive his authority or his power? That ultimately then, do we really honestly believe that this Jesus is capable of doing anything that God wants to do? And notice that as Peter is sinking, he just doesn't let him sink and walk by him. As he's sinking, Jesus is there and pulls him up and puts him back into the boat. Now, I'm sure Peter would have appreciated not having begun to sink in the first place. If you're right there and you see me going down, how long were you going to wait? What are you waiting for? Step in anytime you like. I'm going down here. Just, help out anytime. But he does. Jesus is there, picks him up, grabs him, holds him, and then puts him back into the boat. And somehow I believe we are meant to learn from this that one, how we view our world has everything to do with in whom we have placed our trust. What is it that we believe? In whom is it that we believe? Because what we believe in is where our focus will be, where our sight, where our view will be. It makes all the difference in the world. We can read the newspapers and we can watch all the stuff on TikTok and all those, which social media, all good thing, but we have to realize we're all being impacted more now by this than ever before, and it is terrifying, and those winds, that storm, has an impact on us. It does. But the reality is, what are we going to do? Are we going to watch the storm, or are we going to watch the one who's already walking on the water coming towards us? Do we believe and trust in Jesus' presence? That even with the fear that we have when we're distracted, and we all will be sinking. Peter, you're not the only one. We will all be the ones that are going down at some point or another. But the reality is that God doesn't let us just drown. God is there to hold us up, if we are willing to be embraced by him. See, that's the other point to this that's not really mentioned. In order for Peter to be lifted up, Peter would have had to be reaching out to Jesus for Jesus to grab him and pull him up. And I'm not sure we're not more easily distracted by the storm and the winds and the waves than we are the presence of Jesus who is in the moment. Not because we asked him to be there, but because he wanted to be there. Because he wanted to come out in case we needed his help. He was already present. He was already there. And I think for us, this is very telling about how God operates now, contemporarily, with you and I. How we live our lives. How God interacts with our lives. How God is readily a part of our lives. If we stay focused on him and not upon everything else that happens around us, because all of that will distract us. So the question comes back to, what is it that you believe about this person, Jesus? Why is it that you have chosen Jesus to be the one that you trust in? Why is it that Jesus is the one that you call Messiah, Savior, Lord? Why is it that Jesus is the one that you're praying to? And if you don't know, it's okay. It's all right to admit that, I just never did that. Well, I invite you to. And I invite you to take God head on and go back and forth in that conversation. And I assure you, when you start reading the documents that are in this thing called the Bible, when you start reading those documents, and if you want, explore other writings around the same time about what other people were saying about these believers in Jesus, because that's what we were called. Before we became known as Christians, we were called believers. That's what we were, because we believed in this man Jesus, died and rose from the dead. That's what we were. At our very core, at our rawest moment as people in relationship with Jesus, we were called believers, not Christians. Christians came much later. Because Christians implies Messiah. And Messiah implies that we believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Even before we got to the point of understanding fully Jesus as Messiah, we believed in a relationship with a living Jesus who has sent forth his Spirit that is part of us. We were called believers. But each and every one of those believers was taught. They heard the stories. They were told what it was. And then ultimately, they came to a point of believing and trusting that this person, Jesus, was worthy of our loyalty and our trust and our confidence. It's a process that took place. It's one of the arguments that a lot of the Christian church have about the fact that we should not baptize babies. It's because this type of relationship, this type of faith, requires an adult mind to go through a process of critical thought and evaluation to come to a reality. That makes sense. Of course, now, if we baptize babies, they have this event called a confirmation, where later on, as they are older, they confirm for themselves as individuals who were baptized babies that they themselves now believe that this Jesus is who they are. So if you ever wondered why confirmation came up, it's because of infant baptism. We as adults should be making that commitment. But even there, I'm not really sure if all of us have done the work that is required. Peter was willing to step out of the boat because he knew who this Jesus was. He saw what he was able to do, and he trusted him. And he says, if it is you, I will step out, and I will be able to walk on the water. If not, then, So I think for us as Christians, we should be very open to the fact that critical thinking and a proper comprehension of our faith is really important. And we should be willing to do the work, because as you do the work in trying to ascertain why is it that you believe Jesus is your Lord and Messiah, and why he is the one whose presence you want in your life, then you grow more in your faith. And as you encounter the world, then, through your learning, through your experience, through everything that you have taken in and processed, that you're not alone in all of this. That this Jesus stands with you and is already walking toward you well before you end up in any real trouble. But all of that only comes not just from a fellow or woman preaching on a Sunday morning. It has to be something that we want, something we look at. If we're watching TikTok every day and we're open to all this negativity, why aren't we also looking for how are we going to approach and answer for that negativity and all of that stuff in the evil and problems and issues of the world? How are we going to find our answer to those things as people who really live that? It can't just be a Sunday event. This is great because as a community we come together and we know that we're not the only crazy people. There's other people who believe this too. Isn't that wonderful, right? I mean, that's really like the value and purpose of gathering on a Sunday, is that you're not the only one. But this type of relationship with Jesus is something that, like Peter experienced, if you are around Jesus enough in the course of a day, if you are around him and you learn about him and you open yourself up and you experience him, then when the waves come and the winds come and everything else, you're not afraid to walk out, because you know that it is Jesus standing right there calling you forth. God bless you.